Gaudeamus omnes in Domino, diem festum celebrantes, sub honore sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers, a podcast sponsored by CatholicCulture.org. I'm your host, Mike Aquilina. This is the last of 3 episodes on the great St. Augustine of Hippo. We began by looking at his early life, from his misspent youth through his conversion. We went on to consider his prolific writing and prodigious accomplishments as a Catholic bishop. He negotiated and argued several major heresies out of existence. He refined a distinctive Western style of doing theology. He synthesized and systematized the scattered works of his predecessors, and he articulated a positive theology against which novel speculations could be measured. Along the way, he emerged as an international celebrity, a court of appeal for intellectuals in matters practical and theoretical. He made the humble town of Hippo a center of theological gravity in the Christian world, at least for as long as he himself was alive. In this episode, we arrive at his final years. At the age of 72, when Augustine had been a priest and bishop for nearly 4 decades, he sat down with a pile of his own books. He'd been thinking about doing this for years now, but how much longer would he have? He was still healthy, but he was old and things could change rapidly. So he picked up the first book and started leafing through it. His plan was to go through every major book of his and find what was wrong with it, and also what was right with it. Then he would write down his thoughts in a book he called his Retractationes, reconsiderations or revisions. This was almost inevitable in Augustine. The man who led the most self-examined life of ancient times would have to examine his own writings just as thoroughly. What he found there mostly satisfied him. On the whole, he believed he had expressed himself fairly well. But there were things he had said decades before that he no longer believed, and there were other things he felt he had to qualify. These reconsiderations, however, were most emphatically not a project of his retirement. Augustine never retired. He never rested on long-ago laurels. Though he had lived beyond the proverbial 70, he was still a very active bishop of a church made important by his presence, and he was still laboring at what many scholars considered to be the greatest book of his age, and the foundational work of the age that followed. Augustine was well and working. But all was not well with the Roman Empire. Christian Rome had reached a triumphant high point under Theodosius the Great, who ruled from 379 to 395. Theodosius united the Eastern and Western empires. He made Catholic Christianity the only legal religion in the empire. And he cleverly managed the restless barbarians on the borders by making various deals to put them in the position of allies. He also did public penance for his violent response to a riot in Thessalonica, a penance that Ambrose the bishop had insisted on. Instead of weakening Theodosius, the penance cemented his reputation as Theodosius the Great. He seemed to be the ideal Christian emperor. So no one in the realm could have predicted how quickly the empire would come crashing down after Theodosius died. He left the empire divided between his 2 sons, Honorius in the west and Arcadius in the east. Both were children at the time. Honorius was only 10 years old. The restless barbarians decided it was time to be restless again. Gothic armies under Alaric poured into Italy, and in 410 the unthinkable happened. Rome was sacked. It was the first time in 800 years that Rome had been entered by a foreign enemy. The Goths were bought off with the promise of an enormous payment for their alliance. But instead of fulfilling his promise, the Emperor Honorius ordered the massacre of the Goths' wives and children who had been left behind as pledges. From that moment forward, The Goths just wanted revenge. The great Jerome, who was hardly known as a sensitive and weepy guy, told one correspondent that just telling the tale made him break down in tears. He had been in Jerusalem when the news came from the west. He wrote, "Rome had been besieged, and its citizens had been forced to buy their lives with gold. Then thus despoiled they had been besieged again, so as to lose not only their substance but their lives. My voice sticks in my throat, and as I dictate, sobs choke my voice. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. When the bright light of all the world was put out, the whole world perished in one city. The mother of nations had become also their tomb." Jerome probably exaggerated the horrors inflicted by the Goths, which he had heard secondhand. But what he did not exaggerate was the reaction of people all over the Roman world. If Rome itself could be overrun, was anywhere safe? And if nowhere was safe, were the end times upon us? In the aftermath of the disaster, the game of finger-pointing began. For the pagan remnant, it was clear where the blame should lie. The fall of Rome, they said, was the fault of the Christians. The gods who had favored Rome for centuries were now disdained. The Christians had destroyed the old altars and temples, and now Rome was falling because of its failure to honor the gods. It was the last serious uprising of old pagan Rome, and it was only an intellectual uprising, but it must have seemed dangerous at the time. After all, there were still people alive who remembered Julian the Apostate, the emperor who tried to re-establish paganism as the empire's official religion. Pagans had dwindled further in the half-century since Julian's time, but they were disproportionately represented in the Roman Senate. Many rich and powerful men were still pagan, and they were very rich and powerful. Once again, here was an intellectual crisis, and so it was a crisis that demanded a response from Augustine. In his reconsiderations, he recalled how he began writing his last masterpiece, The City of God. After Rome had been stormed and sacked by the Goths under Alaric, their king, the worshippers of false gods, or pagans as we commonly call them, made an attempt to attribute this calamity to the Christian religion, and began to blaspheme the true God with even more than their wonted bitterness and acerbity. It was this which kindled my zeal for the house of God and prompted me to undertake the defense of the city of God against the charges and misrepresentations of its assailants. It took Augustine years to write his City of God, and even he recognized it as monumental. He said, "This work was in my hands for several years, owing to the interruptions occasioned by many other affairs that had a prior claim on my attention, and which I could not defer. However, this great undertaking was at last completed in 22 books." Once again, we're reminded that writing wasn't Augustine's primary business. He was a bishop, a pastor with a flock to tend to, and he had responsibilities that couldn't wait while he wrote an immense pile of pages. And City of God was immense by any standard. It's more than 400,000 words in one typical English translation. By way of comparison, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, a notoriously fat book, is about half that length. Augustine sized it up as a great work and an arduous one, but God is my helper. It was a pastoral work and apologetic necessity. After all, what if the pagans were right? Some Christians were asking that question. The pagans seemed to have a point. But Augustine's work wasn't just a polemical screed in a paper war with pagan writers. It was, once again, a work of pastoral care addressing a problem of immediate concern to the ordinary parishioners of Africa. Augustine's thesis is that there are two cities, the city of God and the earthly city. The city of God is where Christians live. Whether we view it as it still lives by faith in this fleeting course of time and sojourns as a stranger in the midst of the ungodly, or as it shall dwell in the fixed stability of its eternal seat. The earthly city is opposed to it. This city is Rome, said Augustine, which though it be mistress of the nations, is itself ruled by its lust for power. By extension, the earthly city is wherever people live when they are not living by faith in Christ. For to this earthly city belong the enemies against whom I have to defend the city of God. For Augustine, this is the key to all of history, and all of theology will have to be brought in to make his argument. He begins by pointing out that the sack of Rome, violent as it was completely different from invasions of other cities in the past. When did the victorious invaders ever respect the gods of the defeated? Think of what happened at Troy. Yet the Goths had allowed the citizens to take refuge in the great basilicas while they pillaged the city. Augustine wrote, "All the violence, then, which Rome was exposed to in the recent calamity, all the slaughter, plundering, burning, and misery, was the result of the custom of war. But what was new was that savage barbarians showed themselves in so gentle a guise that the largest churches were chosen and set apart for the purpose of being filled with the people to whom quarter was given, and that in them none were slain, from them none forcibly dragged, that into them were led by their relenting enemies to be set at liberty, and that from them none were led into slavery by merciless foes. Whoever does not see that this is to be attributed to the name of Christ and to the Christian temper is blind. Whoever sees this and gives no praise is ungrateful. Whoever hinders anyone from praising it is mad." So most of the pagans who survived owed their lives to the fact that the Goths were Christians, even if Arian Christians. On the other hand, what did the pagan gods do for the city of Rome in its long history? It was easy for Augustine to come up with a whole list of calamities from Rome's pagan history, and the pagan gods had been no use at all in them. But Christians don't necessarily expect to be spared the difficulties of this world, he explained. We know that the good and the bad suffer and enjoy all the same things in this world, and that doesn't surprise us. Augustine wrote, "Therefore, though good and bad men suffer alike, we must not suppose that there is no difference between the men themselves, because there is no difference in what they both suffer. For even in the likeness of the sufferings there remains an unlikeness in the sufferers, and though exposed to the same anguish, virtue and vice are not the same thing. For as the same fire causes gold to glow brightly and chaff to smoke, and under the same flail the straw is beaten small while the grain is cleansed. And thus it is that in the same affliction the wicked detest God and blaspheme, while the good pray and praise. What makes the real difference is not what ills are suffered, but what kind of man suffers them. For stirred up with the same movement, mud puts out a horrible stench, and ointment emits a fragrant odor." Augustine takes time to debunk pagan superstitions, like astrology, which had him under its spell for years. He argues much like a modern scientist here, pointing out, for example, that twins born under all the same signs can have very different fates. But fate itself is a superstition. Christians know that we have free will, even though God has foreknowledge of everything. Augustine said, "We assert both that God knows all things before they come to pass, and that we do by our free will whatsoever we know and feel to be done by us only because we will it." This is an important distinction. God's foreknowledge does not cancel our free will, which will be useful for the church to remember when John Calvin comes along. To argue his points, Augustine brings all the arsenal of reasoning he picked up from the Neoplatonists. In fact, his City of God is often pointed out as one of the masterpieces of Neoplatonist philosophy, which is a bit ironic because he insists that Platonic philosophy without Christian revelation can never reach the truth. Nevertheless, philosophers are useful, and he points out that many philosophers in all nations and languages have come close to Christian doctrine by reason alone. Nevertheless, the Platonic philosophers, he said, came closest to the real truth. Their juster thoughts concerning the one God who made heaven and earth have made them illustrious among philosophers, Augustine said. Christianity is superior to any philosophy, but Augustine is not at all reluctant to use what he learned from philosophy in discussing Christianity. All the great philosophical questions come up as Augustine explores deeper and deeper into the nature of God and existence. Do we exist at all? The French philosopher René Descartes famously answered, "I think, therefore I am." But he was just summing up what Augustine had already articulated clearly in The City of God. Augustine wrote, "But without any delusive representation of images or phantasms, I am most certain that I am, and that I know and delight in this. In respect of these truths, I am not at all afraid of the arguments of the academicians, who say, 'What if you are deceived?' For if I am deceived, I am. For he who is not cannot be deceived. And since I am, if I am deceived, how am I deceived in believing that I am? For it is certain that I am, if I am deceived." Ultimately, Augustine will have to go back to the beginning, to the creation of the angels and the fall of the evil angels, to find the origin of the two cities. He will have to explore the nature of original sin in depth, and how the nation of Israel was set apart by God to represent the city of God on earth. Finally, he reaches the other end of history, where the two cities meet their final destinies: eternal destruction for the earthly city, eternal happiness for the city of God. The saints will enjoy a perpetual Sabbath in heaven. Augustine builds to a climactic vision of the bliss that no pen can describe. "There we shall rest and see and love, love and praise. This is what shall be in the end without end. For what other end do we propose to ourselves than to attain to the kingdom of which there is no end?" And then, as he prepares to set down his pen for a well-earned earthly rest, he adds, "I think I have now, by God's help, discharged my obligation in writing this large work. Let those who think I have said too little, or those who think I have said too much, forgive me, and let those who think I have said just enough join me in giving thanks to God. Amen." Augustine wrote his last lines as the European provinces flaked off one by one, with barbarian generals carving them into personal kingdoms. Africa fared better for some time, but at last the Vandals, a Germanic tribe who gave their name to senseless destruction, poured into Africa from already conquered Spain. Augustine's friend Posidius left an eyewitness account of the Vandal invasion. He said, "And everywhere through the regions of Mauritania, even crossing over to other of our provinces and territories, raging with cruelty and barbarity, they completely devastated everything they could by their pillage, murder, and varied tortures, conflagrations, and other innumerable and unspeakable crimes, sparing neither sex nor age, nor even the priests or ministers of God, nor yet the ornaments or vessels of the churches, nor even the buildings." By 430, the Vandals were besieging Hippo. These Vandals were Christians, but Arian Christians. Arianism had been withering in the Roman Empire, but outside it flourished. Arian missionaries had been very successful with the barbarians who were now carving up the empire for themselves. And the Vandals were not only Arians, but bigots as well. They hated the Catholic Church with an unholy passion. By this time, Augustine was an old man in his middle 70s, and after a comfortable life, he saw no future for himself or his world. Posidius gives us the reasons for his sadness. "For he saw cities overthrown in destruction, and the resident citizens, together with the buildings on their lands, partly annihilated by the enemy's slaughter, and others driven into flight and dispersed. He saw churches stripped of priests and ministers and holy virgins, and all the monastics scattered in every direction. Here he saw some succumb to torture and others slain by the sword, while still others in captivity, losing their innocency and faith both in soul and body, received from their foes the harsh and evil treatment of slaves. I would have you know," Augustine told his friends, "that in this time of our misfortune I ask this of God, either that he may be pleased to free this city which is surrounded by the foe, or if something else seems good in his sight, that he make his servants brave for enduring his will, or at least that he may take me from this world unto himself. God chose option C. As the Vandals tightened the siege, Augustine began to fall ill. He spent his last days mostly alone, praying the Psalms. He died in 330, just before the Vandals took over the city, which they burned to the ground. All except Augustine's cathedral and his library, which they carefully spared, because even Vandals stood in awe of Augustine. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please consider making a contribution for the continuation of our series. The Way of the Fathers is listener-funded, so we're dependent on the generosity of people like you. Please pay us a visit at catholicculture.org/donate/audio and leave us a note if you love the Fathers. We pray for our benefactors every day. Correction, I misspoke. Augustine died in the year 430.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei. Way of the Fathers is just one of the podcasts produced by CatholicCulture.org. To hear more from the Church Fathers in their own words, check out Catholic Culture audiobooks, readings of Catholic classics, including the Fathers and St. John Henry Newman. You might also enjoy Criteria, the Catholic film podcast devoted to movies of high artistic caliber and Catholic interest. And for interviews on a wide range of topics in Catholic arts and culture, listen to the Catholic Culture podcast.